Hello again from Liverpool. This short video will try to explain some of the key features and controversies surrounding the draft withdrawal package that was published by the UK and EU negotiators last week. Now, let's start by recalling exactly what the proposed withdrawal package actually consists of, and there are two things. First of all, we have the draft text for a withdrawal agreement that concerns the immediate challenges required to ensure that the UK's withdrawal from the EU is smooth and orderly rather than chaotic and disorderly. Now, that agreement will be a legally binding treaty, and so it's no surprise to find that it's long, it's detailed, it's technical. The text has received political endorsement from the UK government, albeit, as we know, at a heavy cost, and it now requires the political endorsement of the leaders of the EU 27, some of whom have expressed reservations, but apparently not so serious as to demand reopening the text. Secondly, we then have an outline for the political declaration that's intended to list the principles that should govern subsequent negotiations on the future UK-EU relationship in fields such as trade and security and the environment and so on. Now, in itself, that political declaration will be little more than an aspirational statement of intent. It won't be legally binding or enforceable. So far, we only have an outline. The two sides intend to flesh out some more details within the next few hours and days, and again, that text will require political endorsement from both the UK and the EU 27. Now, that entire package, the legally binding withdrawal agreement, the political declaration on future relations, will then need to be formally approved by the UK Parliament, by the EU 27 governments meeting within the Council, and by the European Parliament. And if those approvals are granted, we can then move on to ratification and also to implementation in time for the 29th of March 2019. Now, let's offer some more detailed analysis of the content of that withdrawal package, starting with the draft withdrawal treaty. Now, much of the text of that draft treaty was actually agreed back in March 2018 and hasn't changed very much since then. And instead, attention has focused on hammering out an agreement on some of the more controversial but relatively small number of issues. It's fair to say that large parts of this text are of little interest to a general audience. The treaty covers a wider array of pretty specialised, very technical situations where the UK's engagement with EU rules or EU institutions has to be wound down in a managed way. For example, what to do with court proceedings that are still ongoing, or with requests for cross-border police cooperation which are still live. But of course, the draft treaty also deals with some much more important and fundamental issues, including, for example, the question of citizens' rights, the future treatment of people who have already made use of their right to free movement under EU law, either Union citizens in the UK or EU citizens across the EU 27, who are lawfully resident in their host country at the end of the proposed transitional period. Now, here the draft treaty will provide some clarity, some security for the millions of people who've already experienced over 2 years of uncertainty and anxiety. The government says that existing migrant citizens will be able to get on with their lives almost just as before, but of course the key word here is almost. Because in a number of ways, some big, some small, the lives of existing migrant citizens will change, and generally change for the worse. However, talking about those citizens' rights provisions would require a video in itself, and of course we can do one if you'd like. But instead today I'm going to focus on two of the remaining big issues under the draft treaty. Issues that are not only important in themselves, but also now closely interlinked together. The transitional period and the so-called backstop for avoiding a hard border in Ireland. First up, the transitional period. Now, every informed observer knows that the UK remains ill-prepared to cope with the full consequences of the government's decision to leave the EU in March 2019. Now, that's true not only for public but also private sector preparations. It's true not only in terms of having in place the necessary regulatory frameworks and institutions, but also having made the appropriate logistical and infrastructural changes. It's true also of sorting out constitutional relationships within and across the UK, and of course of regularising and rebuilding international relations with a host of other countries and organisations. Now, in order to protect all of us from such a potentially terrible failure of responsible public administration, the draft treaty provides for a transitional period, or as the government still insists on calling it rather misleadingly, an implementation period. So, although the UK will leave the EU at the end of March 2019, not much is actually going to change on the ground until the end of December 2020, because the UK will remain subject to almost all of the same EU rules and regulations as if it were still a member state. Now, the draft provisions on transition were largely agreed back in March of this year, and the idea is pretty straightforward. The UK will have to respect and apply all EU rules, including any new EU legislation, any new European Court of Justice case law, for example, until the end of transition. There will be a few exceptions. For example, there will be restrictions on the UK's ability to opt into new EU measures tackling cross-border crime. But the main difference is that the UK will have no institutional representation in the EU. There'll be no more seat in the European Council, no more vote in the Council of Ministers, no MEPs in the European Parliament, no commissioner, no judges in the European Court of Justice. When Jacob Rees-Mogg describes this transition as a condition of vassalage, he isn't actually far wrong. Even if, of course, the real responsibility for the UK's weakness in this whole situation actually lies with him and his fellow Leave campaigners with their delusions about taking back control. The only significant new amendment in the terms that were agreed back in March 2018 is Theresa May's request for the part to extend the transitional period. Now, of course, in a way that is an implicit admission that even the extra 20 months that was already agreed is simply not enough time for the UK to achieve what it needs to achieve in order to protect itself from the full immediate consequences of Brexit. But the power of extension can only be used once. It can only be used for a fixed period of additional time, and although the draft text hasn't identified an end date yet, we know that it will probably be a year, maybe even 2 years. An extension still requires the agreement of the EU, it's not automatic, and the UK would still be required to make appropriate contributions to the EU budget. Though UK participation in any EU programmes, for example in fields such as research or science, would be on the terms offered to third countries, not member states, again with a price tag. Otherwise, however, the UK would remain bound by its vassalage terms of transition, and that would of course have important knock-on consequences in other areas. For example, for the full entry into force of the new legal world which is provided for under the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, or for the final end of free movement which is so longed for by the Brexit Brigade and promised to them by Theresa May. So much for transition. The second main issue then is the so-called backstop to prevent a hard border in Ireland. Now, the challenges created by Brexit for Northern Ireland are dealt with in a very lengthy protocol to the draft withdrawal treaty. And chief among those challenges, and of course the main source of controversy, both during the negotiations and now with the final proposals, is the so-called backstop guarantee that's meant to avoid the return of a hard border for the physical movement of goods across the island of Ireland, which would otherwise be required for customs and for regulatory purposes after the UK has left the single market in the customs union. Now, both sides hope, really rather optimistically, that the need for a hard border can be avoided simply through the future trading relationship between the EU and the UK as a whole. If that doesn't look likely to be in place by the middle of 2020, the UK could ask for the transitional period to be prolonged using the power of extension that we've just talked about. But in any event, the backstop may well be needed if and when the transitional period expires and there's still no satisfactory alternative, or at least one that's ready to become operational. Now, designing the backstop has been tortuous. As I've said several times before, the inherently difficult conundrum of what to do with the Irish border was made significantly worse by the UK government's insistence on promising irreconcilable things to different groups of people. Something had to give and somebody had to be disappointed. Amazingly, however, the solution which has been brought forward in the draft treaty has managed to disappoint almost everybody at the same time. Now, the centrepiece of the proposed backstop is for a de facto customs union between the EU and the whole of the UK. That will remove tariffs in trade between the two parties and thereby solve at least half of the Irish border problem. But this is a customs arrangement which is built almost entirely on the EU's terms. For example, the UK would have to comply with the EU's tariff system and much of its trade regime in relations with third countries. The UK would have to respect a whole range of minimum standards in fields like competition and state aid, the environment, labour protection, so as to guarantee a level playing field between UK and EU businesses. And just as importantly, this is a customs plan with no definite expiry date. The two parties may hope to replace the backstop with a better alternative in the future, but there's no guarantee that that will happen within any clear timescale, or indeed that it will ever happen at all. And although the government has made much of securing an explicit mechanism for reviewing the backstop, the fact remains that replacing or terminating these arrangements will ultimately require the EU's positive consent. Now, on the one hand, of course, the hard Brexiteers find this thoroughly objectionable. They don't want any form of customs union with the EU, and they see this one, quite rightly, as a perpetuation of the so-called vassalage that was already introduced under the transitional period. It does significantly limit the UK's room for trade agreements with other countries. We can say that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. And it also prevents the Brexit Brigade from pursuing their own hard-right dreams of deregulating the EU's existing social and welfare protection once outside the EU. On the other hand, it's obvious that Remain supporters should also feel unhappy about these proposals. They don't offer full and full-blooded UK membership, not only of a customs union but also of the single market. And of course it seems insane to swap the UK's current position of leadership and influence within the EU for a status of mere rule taker outside the EU institutions but still bound by all of their rules. The EU-UK customs plan, though, is only one element of the proposed backstop, because dealing with customs duties, as we said, will only solve half the Irish border problem. There also remains the challenge of how to avoid the need for extensive checks on goods moving between Northern Ireland and the Republic, so as to guarantee compliance with a whole range of core EU regulatory policies. Now, to achieve that, the draft treaty proposes, in addition, that Northern Ireland should remain subject to the relevant EU rules and processes, and in turn that means either introducing or expanding various checks on goods travelling from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, albeit that the draft deal tries to minimise the burden and the visibility of those additional controls. Now, inevitably, this has attracted the fury of the DUP, who are ideologically fixated on the idea that Northern Ireland can't be treated any differently from the rest of the UK. Small matter that Northern Ireland is already and very self-evidently treated very differently from the rest of the UK for all manner of regulatory and fiscal purposes, and nor does it seem to count that Northern Irish businesses are actually being offered a very advantageous, if not outright privileged relationship, not only within the UK but also with the rest of the EU. But then, rational analysis has perhaps never been among the DUP's strong points. To make matters even more complicated, the special treatment which has been proposed for Northern Ireland hasn't just upset the DUP. It's also caused serious concerns in Edinburgh and, one assumes, in Cardiff. Because the UK government has tried to sweeten the pill of this differential treatment for Northern Ireland by providing a unilateral guarantee that Northern Irish businesses will have full and unfettered, but essentially one-way, access to the British market. Now, not only does that guarantee cut right across some of the devolved competences of Scotland and Wales, but it also distorts right from the outset the founding principles of the UK's own nascent internal market by offering a significant competitive advantage to Northern Ireland, which isn't being offered to Scotland, Wales or other parts of England. So if the backstop proposals have proven explosive, it's not entirely without justification. Enough about the draft withdrawal treaty. Let's say just a few words then on the outline political declaration for the principles that should govern subsequent negotiations about a potential future relationship between the EU and the UK. Now, the short draft that we have so far is largely in line with the guidelines that were published by the European Council back in March 2018. They want an ambitious and wide-ranging partnership. In some fields it will be based on international law, in other fields it will be based on existing EU rules or existing EU models for relations with third countries. In other fields still, they want to achieve something that goes beyond those familiar templates or experiences and have a deeper level of cooperation or alignment. It's all pretty sketchy. There's very little detail, but it really couldn't be otherwise, because these are matters for long, for detailed, technical, but also politically sensitive negotiations, the outcomes of which are not guaranteed, and that will still eventually require the full agreement not only of the UK, but of the EU 27 and the European Parliament. Perhaps the most interesting part of the agreed outline for the political declaration concerns relations on trade, and in particular trade on goods. There's no sign that the EU has surrendered any of its reservations about the cornerstone of the UK government's so-called Chequers Plan. Remember that was the rather implausible idea of creating a combined customs territory in which the UK would continue to apply and enforce EU tariffs, EU regulatory standards, while simultaneously pursuing its own potentially divergent tariffs and regulatory standards, but all without the need for any form of customs checks or controls at the border between the two parties. The draft outline political declaration explicitly envisages that there will be a system of border checks and controls between the UK and the EU. So the Chequers Plan is effectively ruled out. That said, the draft text also suggests that any future relationship on trading goods will build on the backstop proposals contained in the Irish Protocol for customs, territory and for level playing field. So it may well be that the backstop is actually only the starting point for a much closer trade alignment by the UK to the EU than the government is currently publicly willing to admit. And if that's true, of course, it will magnify all of the concerns that we've just mentioned. If you're a Brexit supporter, you're worried about entering a condition of vassalage. For everybody else, you're potentially surprised that the UK is prepared to throw away its leadership and influence so easily. Hopefully we'll find out more about the full political declaration over the next couple of days, but let's wrap up with an overall assessment of this draft withdrawal package so far. Now, of course, we need to be wary of simplistic binary assessments about whether this is a good deal or a bad deal. At the same time, though, Brexit is such a dog's dinner that we need to resist falling for the argument that anything which isn't a complete catastrophe is somehow to be considered a success. Instead, we should acknowledge that the proposed deal is the product both of certain political choices by the UK government, but also of certain stark realities facing the UK as a country. Now, the political choices really started with the Cameron government's decision to hold a referendum without any proper preparations for its potential consequences. And they continued with the May government's decision to endorse and pursue some of the very worst fantasies of the Leave campaign, the delusion that we could have our cake and eat it in relations with the EU, or that global Britain was about to swan onto the global stage and redesign relations with the rest of the world. The 2017 general election was yet another pivotal political choice, not least because the government's parliamentary dependence on the DUP has offered the latter a disproportionate influence over the negotiations and indeed over this entire country's very future. Now, those were all political choices. There could have been different choices, but this deal is partly the result of the decisions, generally pretty bad decisions, that were made by the government. Yet this deal is also the product of certain stark and probably inescapable realities, not least the reality of what it means for a medium-sized country to engage in international negotiations with a global power bloc, let alone in a situation where that inherently smaller country is utterly and hopelessly divided among itself, whereas the stronger power bloc is, perhaps surprisingly, but very resolutely united. To say nothing, of course, of the situation in which the UK is simply desperate for some sort of deal in order to avoid inflicting upon itself an immediate disaster in the form of a no-deal Brexit. Now, against that background, of course, this draft deal has certain merits. It would avoid the short-term chaos of a no-deal Brexit. It would prevent the return of a hard border and therefore the political destabilisation of Northern Ireland. But those merits do come at a significant cost. The vassal state of the transitional period and likely also of the backstop, further mistrust and alienation between London, Edinburgh and Cardiff, to say nothing, of course, of the bitter divisions within the UK government and Parliament. But just as importantly, there's nothing in the government's proposed deal that would actually change the underlying fundamentals of the UK's position. There's still no real clarity and certainly no guarantees about the longer relationship between the UK and the EU. Brexit is still a profound and long-term act of national diminishment. It's still one of the most far-reaching decisions by any population in modern history to disenfranchise itself from a huge range of rights and protections, freedoms and safeguards, not least against its own government. And of course it remains an inspiration for the forces of a liberal authoritarianism which are on the march right across the Western world. Now, it's true that this deal wasn't the only deal that was possible. Even if the stark realities of the UK's position couldn't have changed, it would have been open to the UK government to make different, more responsible, more realistic, more broad-based political choices that could have led to different options and different outcomes. But most of those other possible deals would still have been about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because they would have done little, if anything, to change the underlying fundamentals of the UK position. Now, where does all of that lead us? The reaction of the hardcore Leave campaigners has, of course, been entirely predictable. This mess has nothing to do with them or with their pathological lies or their bizarre delusions. Remember that not long ago the UK held all of the cards in these negotiations. This was going to be the easiest deal in human history. And having lost out in the battle with the real world, those lies now need to be replaced with new lies. Brexit could have been so brilliant, so bold, so beautiful, but it's been ruined by the Brussels bullies and the Remain traitors. And of course, this is just another version of the stabbed in the back myth that's been the common currency of populists and charlatans through the ages. For their part, the less extreme Brexiteers may talk about going back to the negotiating table or even going back to the drawing board, but the fact is that most of the alternative choices and outcomes that may once have been available and possible have now been ruled out simply by lack of adequate time to pursue them. And so Theresa May was right when she said that we're facing a choice between this deal, no deal, or no Brexit. Thanks very much for your attention, and we'll be back soon from Liverpool with updates as events unfold.